Good evening, community. Welcome to the next session of Paranormal Stories, Tales and Encounters with the Paranormal World. My name is Uriel Reyes, and I won't keep you waiting. Turn off the lights, let yourself go, and enter the following tales of the night. My name is Laura Garcia. I'm from San Jose, California. My story is very short. It was around 10 at night when I decided to head home. I had spent the afternoon with my friends downtown, and between laughter and conversation, time slipped away without me noticing. I still had to walk a few blocks to reach the avenue where the buses to my house passed, but at that hour, the street felt lonely. Only a few flickering lights accompanied the silence. I was walking quickly when I noticed from the corner of my eye that someone was coming behind me. I didn't want to turn around immediately. I thought that person was also heading to the bus stop, but the footsteps started to sound closer, synchronizing with mine, as if that person was trying to catch up with me. I don't have to explain how. As a woman, something like this terrifies us regardless of the context, so I quickened my pace. When I reached the stop, I stood next to the metal bench, and that's when I heard a soft voice, barely a whisper.
"Don't run. It's not necessary."
I stood frozen with my heart in my throat. I looked up, and for a fraction of a second saw the reflection of old, worn-out shoes peeking out from under the bench. They were women's shoes, and I could see part of the legs too, but when I looked back, there was no one there. My entire body was filled with chills. It was impossible. There was no one in sight, but that voice, something in its tone felt familiar. That's when I remembered the story of Mrs. Rosa, a religious fanatic who would stand on the same corner at that station and always approach whoever was there to talk about the Bible and warn us about the sins of the world. I know because she was just 2 stations from my house. I walked there many times. They say she died right there near the station, under rather strange circumstances, because they found her badly beaten. But some said she was hit by a car. At least that was the version that was told. Since then, some people say her spirit still roams that station, that she's still seen looking for someone to talk to keep preaching to. My body was shaking, and although I couldn't see anything, I could feel her presence, as if her eyes were watching me. Without thinking, I ran until I reached the avenue where the lights and people made me feel a bit safer. And there, despite the hour, I walked home instead. I told my mom, but I never told my friends what happened to me. I knew they would make fun of me, but every time I pass by there, I still feel that chill. And although it's hard to admit, I walk fast and always avoid that bench, even when it's the closest one to me for getting back home. When Aunt Annalise died, whom I don't even remember meeting, but whose death seems to have shaken the whole family in an ugly way, they sent me to stay overnight with my cousins, the Politos, as we called them, because they were Polo's children. They took us to their maternal grandmother's house, a lady I hadn't met until then, Mama Carmen, the Politos called her, and she told me to call her that too. Her house was made of wood and creaked everywhere, but it was big like the ones in movies. Big enough for us to spend the whole afternoon playing hide and seek. That's how I got to know it. How I discovered it. Hiding in it. The corners were dark, but there was something about the house that made me feel like I was on my own. But when they sent us to bed, they left me in an empty room. And before leaving, the older Polito told me something that threw me off. "Whatever you do, don't answer them." "What?" I asked. "Don't answer the voices. What's going to talk to you from under the bed?" I honestly felt weird, but at that moment I didn't think it was serious. I thought it was a joke to scare me, like I've done too when someone stays at my house and I tell them ghost stories that I make up on the spot. I fell asleep. I thought I heard a voice calling me, first in my dream, but I managed to hear it for a moment when I opened my eyes. Then there was silence, a long silence, and when I was about to fall asleep again, I heard it again. I recognized that voice. It had been 3 years since I'd heard it, and I was starting to forget it. It was my mom's voice. It was my dead mother's voice. I got up without saying anything and left the room, without the courage to look back, to look under the bed. When I reached the door of the room where the Politos were, I felt very ashamed. They were mean. If they saw me this scared, I would never hear the end of it. So I mustered up my courage and went back to my room. It was impossible that this was happening. I was dreaming. I had to be dreaming. I had to go back and fall asleep. I walked back. I entered the room and lay down. And when a good while had passed, when I was more asleep than awake, I heard her again.
Felipe, I forgive you.
You have nothing to forgive me for, I said, almost asleep.
You wished I would die. Of course, I forgive you. Everything is fine.
And you see, community, I have to confess something. My mom had a paralysis problem that affected her last years of life, and I had to take care of her. Since my dad left, I did it alone. He left because he couldn't handle it, the responsibility. But he always kept sending money to cover all expenses. But I, who was there, stopped playing. I stopped doing my homework. I stopped going out on the street with my friends. My life became just one thing, taking care of my mother. And at that moment, I hated my life and everyone in it. Yes, I wished my dad would die, wherever he was. I wished my mom would die and finally go to rest and not be there lying in bed, unable to move, unable to eat on her own, unable to go to the bathroom on her own. That wish was something I had never told anyone. It's something that, in fact, I'm writing for the first time ever to you, community, because I trust you. And so, more asleep than awake, I asked for forgiveness. I asked forgiveness from whatever was talking to me from under the bed. I lowered my hand. I don't know what I was expecting. I don't know if I was expecting someone to touch it or to feel something or whatever, but I lowered my hand and eventually fell asleep. I was awakened by a distant sound, a sensation in my hand. Something was touching me. A rough, hard hand that came out from under the bed was touching me. At first, I thought I was still dreaming. I didn't want to open my eyes, but I could feel it in my hand. My heart was beating hard, and I felt something pressing on my chest. But at the same time, my curiosity was stronger. That sensation that something was wrong, that something was down there, invaded me, and without knowing why, I had the courage to look down. I swear it was there, barely distinguishable. A hand with long, thin fingers. A hand that came out from under the bed. A hand that was clinging to mine. With grayish, dry skin, as if it belonged to someone who hadn't seen light in years. I remember the cold I felt throughout my body, but I remained frozen, unable to let go of that hand that was now squeezing me tightly.
Forgive me,
whispered the voice in a tone between pleading and accusing. I remained silent, trying to process if this was real or if I had simply fallen asleep again, if I was simply trapped in a nightmare.
Do you forgive me? Felipe, do you forgive me?
The voice insisted again, in a tone I had never heard from my mother. It was as if something different, was using her voice, but distorting it. My mother's voice that, at the same time, wasn't hers. Only then did I remember what the older Polito had said. Don't answer it. And there, with that hand squeezing mine, I suddenly understood the weight of his warning. I understood that it was literal, but it was late. I had already spoken. Not knowing what else to do, I bit my lips, closed my eyes, wishing that thing would simply disappear. I pulled my hand to free myself, but the pressure increased, and I felt how that hand began to pull me down, as if it wanted to drag me with it.
Felipe, let me go. Felipe, let me go.
Mumbled the voice, now softer, as if it were wrinkling. But it was no longer a plea that moved me. That voice had become harsh, and deep down I knew that whatever was under the bed was something completely opposite to my mother. I fought, struggled, and finally managed to break free from that cold, dry grip. I backed away to the wall, feeling my breath catch. Seconds, or perhaps minutes, passed in a silence so dense it seemed impossible. Shortly before sunrise, I heard noises in the kitchen. I ran out and found Mama Carmen getting up, and I told her what had happened. She listened to me in silence, with an expression I couldn't quite understand. In the end, she smiled and told me not to overthink it, that it had surely been a hallucination, caused by going from cemetery to funeral home those days. She asked me not to pay attention to her grandchildren, who were just mischievous ghost story lovers and had undoubtedly taken the opportunity to scare me, to plant that idea in my head. According to her, they themselves had invented that warning to avoid entering that room anymore, to have someone else occupy the room that had always scared them. But although I wanted to believe her, I knew I had heard my mom's voice. That part I remembered clearly, as clear as the words she said to me. What I still tried to convince myself today was just a nightmare, is that cold hand, that rough hand like a dead person's, that came out from under the bed. Because although every night I tell myself it was a dream, that memory remains there, like the most real nightmare I've had in my life. Thank you for staying here. Subscribe to this space if you haven't already and leave us a 5-star review. Only if you really liked the episode. For now, it's time to continue. We continue because there are still more stories tonight. Good evening, Uriel. I would like to share my experience with you and the entire community. My name is Cassandra. I was born in a small town in the highlands of Jalisco, a place full of myths and legends. Some members of my family even practice witchcraft intermittently. In my case, although some might say I'm hard to scare, the truth is I'm quite fearful. However, I'm attracted to everything related to horror. I find an addictive adrenaline in reading, watching, or playing video games about the subject. That said, perhaps because of all the family beliefs, I tend to be careful not to get involved with things or places I don't understand. Throughout my 29 years, I've had several very close encounters with the paranormal. I've seen apparitions of people who are no longer in this world, shadows, and other strange events. For me and most of my family, believing in these things has never been a doubt, but a certainty. My story begins in July 2021. I was studying biology in a small coastal town in southern Jalisco. It was a very quiet and simple place, with few activities. After the pandemic, money in my family, like in many others, began to run short, and necessity forced me to look for a job that paid better than the cyber cafe where I worked on weekends. That's how I ended up in one of those convenience stores that are everywhere. I thought it was a good option since the schedules were somewhat flexible for students, and there weren't many other options, especially in the low season. The hiring was quick. It seemed like the perfect job, with good bonuses and everything. However, I soon began to have problems with the manager. As a student, I had very limited time. I went to school from 7 to 2 and worked from 3 to 11. I barely had time to eat on the way. One afternoon, very tired of this routine, I had an argument with him about my lunch break. Angry, the manager told me to stop complaining and get to work, that if I continued like this, he would leave me tronada, meaning in the worst possible shift. And that same week, my friend and I had to receive the store's product shipment. We were talking about TV series and music when suddenly my friend stared at the jackets next to the cold room and said, "No way, Cass. They just moved." At that moment, completely fed up with the mistreatment and school stress, I told her not to joke about those things, that it must have moved because of the air or something. but she insisted, and I, thinking she just wanted to scare me, responded angrily. "It's nothing, and if there is something, let it stop bothering me. I have enough dealing with the idiot manager and the miserable salary to also have to worry about ghosts." And so the days passed, and the manager fulfilled his threat. He assigned me the night shift on a Friday, right when there was a university party at the bar next door. I had no choice but to accept it, although at least they would pay me better at night, and I'm not much of a party person anyway. The shift went normally, several drunk customers and others high on who knows what, but nothing out of the ordinary. However, around 2 in the morning, it started raining heavily. The storm was so strong that the power went out in the entire store, forcing us to depend on the emergency generator. It was then that a lady, a frequent customer, approached me and said something that chilled my blood. "Be very careful, honey. Here in this store, a little girl appears in the aisles. Years ago, she was run over, almost right here in front on the corner." And as if regretting what she had just told me, the lady tried to calm me down, assuring me not to be scared, that the girl wasn't bad, but tired as I was and after dealing with out-of-it people all night, I barely paid attention, although deep down her words left me with a strange feeling. I finished my shift at 7 in the morning and forgot about it, until a couple of weeks later, I was alone with another coworker on the morning shift. It was approximately 1 in the afternoon, the quietest hour, when my coworker asked me to refill the refrigerators. I entered the warehouse, loaded one of the carts with lots of sodas, beers, and other things, but when I was about to enter the cold room, right at the door, I could see small, very pale fingers. I didn't pay much attention to them because, although I believe in the paranormal, I don't think all noises or strange things have to do with it. I simply assumed that my coworker, who had gone to the bathroom, had leaned against the door. I closed it and pushed the cart to the back of the cold room. I took a can, and when I was about to arrange it, I saw through the refrigerator glass that my coworker was already outside at the register. She had quite a long line. There was no one else in there with me. It couldn't have been her hand. I felt an immense fear, and remembered that the warehouse and hallway lights turn off automatically every few minutes. After seeing that, I thought the most prudent thing would be to leave before the light went out. The last thing I wanted was to stay there in the dark after having seen those fingers holding the door, especially because I have a terrible fear of darkness. When I tried to leave, I pushed the door, but something pushed it back toward me with great force, almost making me fall backward. I looked through the glass again. My coworker was still at the register. We were the only ones on shift and no one had any reason to be on that side of the store, with no public access. I tried to regain my composure and decided to call my friend to calm down a bit. What happened next continues to be one of the most inexplicable events I've experienced. On the other end of that phone line, I heard a baby babbling. My friend started scolding me. She said it wasn't funny to imitate a baby, especially when her little brother was so sick in the hospital. She said that joke seemed in very poor taste. I tried to explain that it wasn't me, but she hung up. And there I was, alone in the refrigerator. Dead scared, I decided that if even being there they were bothering me, the best thing was to face my fears. I pushed the door. I walked until I reached my register. My hands, everything was shaking, and I didn't go back in there for the rest of the shift. I didn't care if they were going to scold me for not having left the refrigerator full. I arrived home a couple of hours later, still frightened. Of course, I told everything to my friend, who made fun of me since she believes everything happened because of the day I complained to the spirit for not letting me work. But remembering what the lady, the client, told me, I decided to return to the store. I apologized in the darkness for having been so disrespectful to this girl's spirit, and I left an offering with some candies. I also said some prayers for her eternal rest. Believe it or not, coincidence or not, after that, I never experienced anything paranormal in that place until I quit a couple of months ago. Good evening. A couple of days ago, I discovered that I love your stories and the way you tell them. I'm writing to share something that happened to me a while ago, in November 2011, when I was at the IMS hospital in a city in the state of Zacatecas, doing my medical internship. That night, I had duty in the gynecology area, and past midnight, I was at the nursing station, writing notes. I don't remember the exact time because right at that moment, it was snack time in the hospital cafeteria. In the area where I was, the nursing station was the only way to enter the rooms where the patients were hospitalized. All rooms shared a hallway that led directly to this station. The nurse in charge told me she would go take her snack and that she would administer the pending medications, leaving me alone in the area. I took the opportunity to check on a patient who had pending medication. I went to her room, asked her some routine questions, and finally told her, "The nurse will come soon and give you the medication." To my surprise, she answered, "She already came. You must have crossed paths with her in the hallway before entering." I got chills. I knew I was completely alone in that area. With a trembling voice, I asked her how the nurse was dressed. The patient responded, "She's wearing a completely white dress, white stockings, and white nurse heels. Those typical nursing shoes." Fear invaded me at that moment, because nurses now wore green scrubs and sweaters, and that's how the nurse who was supposed to attend to that patient was dressed. There was no way someone else could have passed through the nursing station without me seeing them while I was writing. When the nurse returned from her snack, I asked if she had already administered the medication to the patient, and she said no, that she was about to do it. I told her what the patient had said, and she also turned pale. She went to check on her, and upon returning, told me that the patient had repeated the same thing, that she had already been given her medication by the other colleague. Only the nurse and I were there, and to this day I've always thought that perhaps it was an apparition of the famous La Planchada. Could it be possible? Anyone out there, especially those with hospital experience, knows if this apparition, if this legend is true. This story was told to me by my grandmother, who passed away almost 5 months ago. Before she departed, I made sure to ask her all the details of this experience, as she was sick and we knew she wouldn't be with us much longer. My grandmother was from a small town called Cieneguita in Guanajuato. She told me that her paternal grandmother, when she was little, never liked her. She was very mean to her, perhaps because my grandmother had to take care of the house and cook after her mother's early death. That woman wasn't just rude, she treated her like a servant. She was so afraid of her that she avoided being alone with her, because besides the mistreatment, she would pinch her and pull her hair if she didn't obey. Eventually, this lady fell ill and was bedridden for a long time, suffering from a disease that ultimately led to her death. The day she died, she asked to speak with my grandmother, saying she wanted to say goodbye and apologize for all the harm she had done. My grandmother didn't want to enter the room. She was terrified of seeing her in such a deteriorated state, and even more so while she was sick, as she always felt a strange energy in her presence. She said the house felt cold and heavy, as if something evil inhabited it. Finally, my grandmother entered the room, and the lady, with a weak voice, asked for forgiveness. My grandmother responded that she forgave her, that she should go in peace, that she should seek the path to God. However, her grandmother answered with a dark look, "Not with God. I'll go anywhere but to God." She died that same afternoon. After her death, the house felt colder and more haunting than ever. While they waited for someone to come collect the body, they say a chilling air was blowing, and the wind whistled as it passed through the trees around. Being surrounded by wilderness, nothing could be seen beyond the shadows of the trees, and nothing could be heard but that wind whispering through the branches. In the midst of that silence, my grandmother heard what seemed to be crying, a distant cry, a deep lament among the trees. She didn't know if she was imagining it or if something was really crying out there. That night, while others prepared the house for the wake, my grandmother stayed in the kitchen, feeling an unusual cold for that time of year, as they were just coming out of summer. The next morning, while they were washing the body, my grandmother and her cousins were playing in the yard. There was an old tree there, where her grandmother used to sit when she was alive, and they decided to play hide and seek near it. At one point, my grandmother and one of her cousins ran towards the tree to hide. Upon arriving, they stopped dead in their tracks, unable to move, their legs trembling. There, sitting under the tree, they saw their grandmother. She says she stared at them fixedly with dark, empty eyes, without a trace of life in them. My grandmother felt a terror she had never felt before, as if she was seeing something that didn't belong to this world. Her cousin saw her too. They both ran away with their hearts pounding like never before. They knew it wasn't possible, that she was already dead. While the adults prayed for their grandmother's soul, my grandmother heard the words that, although speaking of God and the Virgin, sounded chilling in the silence of the wilderness, that pray for her and for us sinners seemed to float between the trees and the wind, creating a macabre atmosphere that even when telling me this story, still gave her chills. They ran back to the house. My grandmother immediately entered the room where the wake was being held. Everyone looked at her strangely for barging in, but she just wanted to confirm that the corpse was still there, in the coffin. When she approached and saw her, she felt her heart stop. She was sure she had seen her outside, there, sitting under the tree. However, the body remained in the coffin, while the wind and prayers continued to sound in a somber tone. The next day, they took her grandmother to the town cemetery. The ceremony proceeded normally. They held the mass and burial and placed a rosary between her hands, which they carefully crossed over her chest. However, the next day, someone came with news that the body had been dug up. My grandmother's father immediately went to check, and to his amazement, found the coffin in the hole and his mother's body outside, with arms extended, and the rosary that should have been in her hands was inside the coffin. They rearranged her and repeated the burial. The following night, someone again reported that the lady had been dug up again. They thought perhaps it was a macabre joke, an act of vandalism, so they decided to place guards at the cemetery. Once more, they arranged her inside the coffin. They tied her hands and placed the rosary between her fingers. But the next morning, the body was outside again, in the same position, with arms extended, and this time, giving off a decomposition smell they couldn't ignore. The situation couldn't continue like this. The body was already showing signs of deterioration, and the parish priest suggested that perhaps the lady was rejecting holy ground. With great sorrow, the family made the decision to remove her from the cemetery and bury her outside sacred ground. It was only after this final burial, far from that cemetery, that the body finally remained at peace. Since then, no one saw her haunting the house again, and there were no more news of disinterments. Her grave remains outside the cemetery to this day. It's the only body in that place and is an unsettling reminder of that presence that didn't want to find rest among the dead. I know this story might seem simple, but my grandmother always assured me that all of this was real and that the fear she felt at that moment was profound, because it's not normal for a body to have been dug up so many times, and this community is just one of the many stories my grandmother told me. I hope, later on, to share others with you. Have a very good night.